Welcome. This is Resilience Radio. Who am I? I'm Irvin Eisenberg, host of the show and owner of Resilience Occupational Therapy. As always, the opinions on this show are not necessarily shared by me or Resilience, and the advice is not necessarily pertinent to you. Everyone's got their own individual healthcare needs, and you should approach that accordingly. Today's guest is Maria Noël Groves. She is an herbalist and author, having written Body into Balance and Grow Your Own Herbal Remedies. And most recently, she has written, and has not quite gone out yet, the Herbal Remedies for Sleep. It's great to have you on, Maria.
Thanks so much for having me.
So you've just got this book, Herbal Remedies for Sleep. Can you speak a little bit to your background and what got you interested in sleep?
Yeah, the book is releasing in late April in 2024. And so I'm not quite sure exactly when this audio will air. And this was really the topic that got me into herbal medicine. So I was in college getting my journalism degree and starting to dive a little bit into the world of healing herbs and, get a few books, read a few articles, like really baby herbal at that point in time. And I had a very stressful and traumatic event around that time. And as a result, I ended up with panic attacks and insomnia. And I also did a lot of the deep work, but it eventually dawned on me that I might be able to turn to herbs, because up until that point, all of my learning about herbs was sort of purely academic. It was just reading about things. It wasn't actually working with the herbs directly. So I went to one of the local herb shops near my college. They hooked me up with valerian and kava, and those are pretty classic herbs for sleep and stress, and especially during that time in the 90s. And they ended up being really helpful as part of my own healing journey. And so now I actually am an herbalist. I've since gone through a lot of schooling to become a practicing herbalist. And I've been working with herbs for more than 20 years at this point. And a lot of my clients also come in with sleep as one of their concerns. And in herbal medicine, we have a few core areas that we tend to focus on when we're looking at somebody's overall health. And there are certain cornerstone or foundational pieces of our well-being that make a profound impact on our well-being, but also a lot of other sometimes seemingly disjointed health concerns. And when we're working with folks, if sleep seems to be out of whack in somebody, that tends to be one of the first places we'll look to support, because by getting a better night's sleep on a more regular basis, oftentimes many other health concerns will become a lot more manageable. And so that's kind of a little bit about what brought me and where it still impacts my own life. And the publishers actually approached me a little while ago to see if I wanted to focus a book a little bit more specifically on sleep. And I was like, yeah, that sounds great. We could use it, because sleep definitely isn't getting better for most people. For most people, sleep and stress and all of that seem to kind of be ratcheting up and up over the years due to a variety of different things.
So sleep and stress around sleep is what brought you into herbalism to begin with. And now 20 years later, you've got this book on it. I assume you've been sort of studying the aspects of sleep and relaxation stuff with herbs ever since the beginning of that.
Definitely, yes.
And it was the publishers, you said, that brought you into it, but do you feel like in writing this book, you've deepened your knowledge, or just finally got the knowledge you have down on paper?
I think it's more about getting the knowledge that I've had, what I've learned, what I've experienced, what I've seen my clients experience down on paper. I don't know that there was anything particularly earth-shattering that I unearthed in the development of it. This is a topic that I do cover to some extent in the first two books, but Herbal Remedies for Sleep is revisiting some of those concepts and then expanding and really focusing on it. And so with some new recipes, and adapted some of that information to be even more specific for sleep. And so I think one of the areas that I've been delving into more and more in the last few years, including in this book, are some of the reasons why people might not be sleeping well. I mean, sometimes it's just that I'll sleep when I'm dead mentality or sleep hygiene. But for a lot of people, they're trying to do all the things, and they might even be taking some of the herbs, and they still just can't get a good night's sleep. And there are some really basic reasons why that can happen for a lot of folks. And starting to look at that, sleuth it out, understand it, and address it can be one of the big pieces. So I'd say that that's something that I've been focusing more on, and also is one of the more unique aspects to this book, in addition to just having a lot more content around sleep and relaxation and stress, and recipes, fun recipes too.
So can you speak a little more in depth about sleep and like what we've sort of what is sleep and some of the mechanics of that experience that people might not be aware of?
Yeah. So when we're sleeping, that's an incredibly important time for our body to help maintain our balance of being in stress state versus in a non-stress state. So the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system response. When we're sleeping well, sleeping regularly, sleeping deeply, our body is going to have an easier time being more resilient to stress, while also having more energy throughout the day. Our immune system is going to function better because our body does a lot of that deep restful work while we're sleeping, around healing the body, healing the tissues of our body, decreasing inflammation in our body, helping to support our detoxification systems. I mean, we detoxify all the time, but a lot of our most important detoxification work happens while we're sleeping, and a variety of other things as well, but those are some of the biggies. And so if we're not sleeping well, we tend to see a lot of issues around cognition, connective tissues. You might even notice like people get the dark circles, their skin just starts to look a little bit more sallow. No matter what your skin tone is, things become a lot less vibrant. And we end up with more likelihood for blood sugar dysregulation. We are much more likely to catch infections. There was one neat study where they took folks, and if they were getting about, I think it was about 6 hours or fewer sleep per night, everybody got swabbed with the common cold in their nasal passages. The folks who had slept just a little bit less than the others were 3 times more likely to get sick from that exposure to the common cold. So we know that it affects our immune system, it can affect our cognition, and vice versa. And so there are a lot of ways in which sleep can help reset us throughout the day and throughout the night. And when there's a breakdown, that can affect a lot of other health concerns as well. So when we're in sleep, we go through various stages of deep relaxation and less deep relaxation. Our melatonin, which is one of our big sleep hormones, tends to be increasing and then gradually start to taper off as the night goes on. And we just do a lot of the cleanup work of our body. But if we're not sleeping well, we're not sleeping long enough, those things may not happen as efficiently. And that starts to accumulate. We feel it throughout the day.
Could you speak a little bit to the difference between like trouble getting to sleep, amount of hours sleeping, and then what quality sleep looks like? What's like ways of measuring or either measuring or sort of, not necessarily, doesn't have to be quantitative, but qualitatively, what are the different things that can go wrong with sleep?
Well, as a general rule, usually sleeping about 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night is a pretty good sweet spot for most people. There will be variations in that, but it does seem like, as a general rule, if you start to get fewer than 7 hours of sleep per night, that some of those deteriorating aspects start to add up of not getting enough sleep. And then also when folks sleep more than 9 hours, often that has some negative effects as well. And so usually 7 to 9 hours is a sweet spot. And I'm talking about adults. Younger folks usually need more sleep than older folks, but for adults. And then falling asleep, it can take a little while to fall asleep. That's okay. Most people, if they're in a healthy, optimal state, will fall asleep within anywhere from like a few minutes to maybe 30 minutes. And it's also pretty normal to wake up maybe once in the night, but hopefully if that happens, you can fall back to sleep pretty well. Now, one of the tricks is that sometimes people are in bed, they think they're sleeping, and maybe they are sleeping a bit, but they are not sleeping as restfully as their body would really like. And that may or may not be apparent. You might wake up and find a difficult time falling back to sleep, or you might be waking up frequently throughout the night, and that's really disruptive. Sometimes people are not aware of those things, or they may not be getting into some of the deeper stages of sleep. We are naturally going through a variety of stages of sleep that are more deeply restful and more alert, and some of that is normal. But if we're not able to get into those deeper stages, as well as those REM or REM stages, that's going to be less restorative for the body. And you might not always know whether or not you're getting there. That's where working with a doctor to get a referral for a sleep study can give a good idea, like, are you breathing throughout the night? And what are your sleep stages like? Are you getting into those deeper sleep states? And you might even look at other things like blood sugar and what's your blood sugar doing throughout the night, because that can also impact your sleep. And you might not be aware that it's happening. You just might know that you're waking up feeling tired, or you're waking up with a headache, or you just don't feel great the next day. And you may not always know exactly what's happening throughout the night. So those are some of the baseline things. So we should fall asleep pretty easily if we wake up, maybe even wake up and need to pee. That's especially pretty common as we get older in all genders. And once is fine. And as long as you can fall back to sleep pretty quickly, that's still considered normal. But if you're waking up a lot, you can't fall back to sleep, you're not feeling vital when you get up, even if you did get what seems to be a good amount of sleep, those would be some of the signs that maybe your sleep is not optimal, and doing a little bit more sleuthing to figure out what's going on and what we can do to support it could be helpful.
Okay. So if someone isn't getting as much sleep during they're not getting a full 7 to 9 hours, or they're waking up some, or having just not feeling restful, when do you feel like a nap is appropriate?
Napping can be a bit controversial. So there are benefits to napping to give us a little bit of a reset. And there are some studies showing benefits to a little nap in the middle of the day, or whenever you're feeling a little bit of a slump. However, napping can sometimes make it harder to fall asleep later. And so there are a lot of differing opinions. I'm an herbalist. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a sleep studies specialist. So that big caveat there, that there are other folks who are going to have some opinions who might have more training in all of this than I do. But I feel like if somebody's really exhausted, let's say you're driving and you're just so exhausted, that might be a good time to pull off the road and take a nap, because your body might take a nap for you, whether or not you have control over it. And so that might be a good time to give yourself a little bit of a reset. Usually, I believe generally they recommend shorter naps, like 10 minutes, 20 minutes being a good amount, versus like an hour or more. Usually that can be more disruptive to your overall cycle for the day, if you will. And so those can be some of the things that we might want to think about. If you're having a big slump in the afternoon and you just feel like you desperately need a nap, that might be important so that you can get through the rest of the day. But it's also a sign that something is probably off, that there's something that might not be going well. Maybe your blood sugar isn't doing well. Maybe what you're getting for sleep at nighttime isn't as good of quality as you think. Maybe you have something like sleep apnea that is preventing you from getting an ideal quantity of sleep. And we know that with sleep apnea, people are much more likely to nod off during the day. If you lay down to watch a movie or sit down to watch a movie, people are falling asleep in their chairs more often. They nod off while they're driving. That's actually one of the biggest life-threatening risks of sleep apnea, or just poor sleep, but especially sleep apnea. And so if you're regularly feeling like you desperately need a nap in the middle of the day, that could be a sign that it's time to dig a little deeper and figure out what's going on at night, as well as what's going on during the day in your body. And you may find that very simple tweaks could make a huge impact in your quality of sleep at night, as well as where you're at throughout the day.
Okay. So in general, your naps are something that's sort of when you need to. There shouldn't be shame around, that you're saying, but and if it's something you need regularly, that might be a red flag that warrants further investigation.
That would be my perspective on it, for sure.
Now, and I know the caveat of you're not a sleep doctor, you're an herbalist. I've heard the argument that that sort of the idea of 8 hours of sleep sort of came from post-industrial revolution, where basically the idea that we would get all of our sleep at once. And there's a lot of theories out there regarding polyphasic sleep, either waking up in the middle of the night, going to sleep early, waking up in the middle of the night, doing the first waking, and then going back to sleep again on the longer winter days. And then of course many people know of the siesta, which is sort of the big rest in the middle of the day. Do you feel like if those are regular rhythms within people's lives, or do you have any thoughts on sort of breaking up the main sleep beyond sort of the short naps, and when that may or may not be appropriate?
My point of view is that we should listen to our bodies and what we do and how we feel, and have that be one of our guiding things. So if you can get good quality sleep at night and you feel vital during the day, that's awesome. I'd say that's what most of my clients are aiming for and are working to achieve, and often do end up achieving that. And our day-to-day lifestyles here in the United States often doesn't accommodate a lot of midday sleeping or middle of the night waking. However, if you find that a different routine works for you and you feel really vital, then certainly feel free to listen to that. But I would say for most people, we're usually focusing on getting that approximate 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. I think most of the research tends to be in harmony with that. However, individual bodies are different. Also, individual areas of the world and what their own cultural lifestyles are like will make a big difference. If you're living in an area where it's dark for more than 12 hours of the day at night, then that might be a good time to wake up and have a little bit of a daytime activity like thing, maybe get up and read, do some creativity, and then go back to sleep. That might work really well for you. Or in those really hot climates where it's just like too darn hot to get a whole lot done, that could be a great time to do some resting so that you can have more of your work or your social or your creative time in those cooler hours later in the evening. So some of that might be cultural, some of it might be biologic, sometimes it has to do with where your ecosystem is as well. It's not as big of an area of my personal focus as an herbalist, but if something is working for you and you feel really vital and your health is pretty optimal, then I would say that's great. But if you're doing it because it just is how you get through the day and you are not feeling optimal with it, you're not feeling well rested when you're done with sleep, you're not feeling vital during the day, you're nodding off at inappropriate times, those would be suggestions to me that it's more of a coping mechanism of perhaps some dysregulated sleep than it is actually the optimal way for you and your body to sleep. That's my take on it, at least.
Okay. So before we jump into the herbs itself, because that's really where your specialty lies, do you feel like there are categories of sleep dysregulation, and I guess would be the term I use unless there's some broader term that should be used, that you sort of like is there a set of herbs for staying asleep and a set of herbs for getting to sleep and a set of herbs for making sure that sleep is restful when you are asleep? Are there categories of sleep dysregulation that you would sort it into?
Yeah, I might think of that as three different things entirely. So there may be categories of sleep dysregulation. Since I'm not a sleep doctor, I don't tend to focus as much on, exactly what's going on in the sleep cycles, since I can't necessarily assess that. One of the things I do focus quite a bit of energy on in my practice, especially as it's evolved in my understanding over the years, is trying to figure out what's the culprit behind not getting a good quality sleep. Especially, I work with a lot of postmenopausal and perimenopausal folks, and we can often see this middle of the night, like waking up in an alarm state. Usually it's almost exactly 4 hours after you went to bed, no matter what time you went to bed, and then a difficult time falling back to sleep until just before it's about time to wake up. And then people finally fall back to sleep. So it certainly has to do with sleep phases, but there's something disrupting that. There's something creating some agitation there, causing a surge of stress hormones. So that tends to be what I'm looking at overall etiologies. That's something where I'm looking at with my clients to see if we can find any patterns. And if we can support those patterns, will that make an impact in their sleep? And it also can help me decide what herbs to turn to, because in addition to the typical quote unquote sleep herbs, we might also look at herbs and diet and lifestyle approaches that will address whatever those underlying concerns. So some big things that I'll focus on there would be light cycles, so like light and dark and when you're exposed to them, artificial light, good sleep hygiene, but also looking at things like blood sugar balance. That can be a really big thing, that if our blood sugar isn't balanced, which I think it's less than 8% of the adult population in the United States is cardiometabolically healthy by the latest research. So a lot of us have some amount of blood sugar dysregulation, even if we're not officially diabetic or prediabetes. The blood sugar crash in the middle of the night can be one of the things that wakes us up. And you might not know, because when you wake up, it's because your body is going into, oh my goodness, my blood sugar is low. Let's throw some in from storage. And it's that process that can sometimes wake us up. If you have sleep apnea, that can wake you up. And more people have sleep apnea than just your sort of stereotypical overweight, often, folks with testes who are snoring like a chainsaw at night. Those are the folks who are most apt to get diagnosed with sleep apnea. But there are a lot of folks, especially folks with ovaries and folks who are born with ovaries. Folks might be smaller bodied. They may or may not snore, but they might still have some things that are causing sleep apnea. And that, again, your body goes into this alarm state because you're not breathing. And that alarm state can wake us up. As folks are going through hormonal shifts, especially peri and postmenopause, as well as when we're dealing with things like surgical menopause, those things can also create a severe disruption. And I would strongly suspect from talking to some of my colleagues that some of the gender transition stuff may also agitate that as well, because we get some relaxing effects of estrogen, and testosterone tends to be a more energizing hormone, that folks may find that they're having a really hard time sleeping as they're going through those hormonal transition times. And then another biggie, and there can be other things as well, but another biggie of the categories that I would wonder about would be stress. Just simply being in a stress state during the day can make it harder to stay in a relaxed state. Maybe you're so exhausted when you fall asleep, you get there, but then as soon as you get just enough rest, if there's a little bit of disturbance somewhere, that's enough to wake you up. And then because of the stress hormones being a tad higher, a lot of this comes down to cortisol surging at the wrong time of the day, but for different reasons, that can end up disrupting the quality of sleep going further. So those are some of the things that I tend to look at the most often in my practice, because just giving sleep herbs may or may not be enough to address what's going on, looking at the underlying cause at the same time. And then when we get into the herbs themselves, so a little bit more to your question, we do have a variety of categories of herbs. I would say the most supportive herbs tend to either be the nervines or the nervines, however you want to say that. These are the herbs that are very restorative for our nervous system and tend to foster being more in a relaxed state, but not necessarily being sedated. And most people would benefit from having more nervines in their life. No matter what's going on with somebody's sleep, nervines will often be at least part of the supportive protocol there. And so herbal examples of that would be things like lemon balm, long-term use of milky oats, maybe skullcap, although skullcap kind of borders on being a little bit more relaxing as well, depending upon the person. Maybe ashwagandha, which is also an adaptogen. Maybe holy basil or toadleaf, which is also an adaptogen. Those are a few of my favorites. And then we'll also start looking at herbs that are more and more overtly relaxing, herbs that start to have an inhibitory effect on the central nervous system. That's like putting the dimmer switch on that awakeness. And those can also be helpful. Those are what we tend to consider as our classic sleep herbs. So valerian, it's a little quirky. Valerian does not work for everybody, but valerian I would consider to be more of a stronger sedative and relaxant. Hops, pretty strongly sedative and relaxant. Passion flower, one of my favorites of the more sedative or relaxant herbs for just kind of quieting down the mind, turning down that central nervous system response. But with those stronger sedatives, they're not always appropriate for everybody. And especially, for example, with sleep apnea, sometimes people will find that they're worse when you take a stronger sedative because they also can decrease respiration and relax muscles. And that may make you even more likely to go into that apnea state. And so that would be a potential flag for me if I see that folks are trying the more sedative herbs and they seem like they're feeling worse in the morning, or they're noticing that they're waking up more at night, or they're having a headache in the morning, from the lack of oxygen throughout the night. Those would be signals to me that maybe we need to do a little bit more deeper work looking into sleep apnea, suggesting that they go get a sleep study. They're pretty easy to get nowadays. You can do some of them at home and explore that a little bit more. Are they getting oxygen throughout the night? Also, sometimes those stronger sedatives can be more aggravating for depression for some people. So they don't always agree with everybody, but they are sort of the classic category of herb, and they can be really helpful for a lot of folks. But with any of the herbs, we will tend to respond individually better to one herb or another. And then that category of stronger relaxants is not always appropriate for everybody for supporting sleep.
Okay, so you've got the nervines that help regulate the nervous system in general, and those could be usually taken just about any time of the day or throughout the day. And that's going to help regulate the ups and downs of energy overall. And then you've got your dimmer switch herbs, your classic relaxation herbs, and they would be taken later in the day usually, or when you need to calm down for some reason, and they might not always be appropriate for folks because of sleep apnea or other things, that there might be reasons why sedation is not the way to go, or that specific sedation, that there's specific herbs that each person responds to differently. What would you be doing for the person with sleep apnea, or who has I guess there's a couple different, the person who's got the disturbance in the middle of the night, because you described that, I feel like that overlaps with the sleep apnea, but also you discussed the hormonal aspect of that. Is there a category of herbs that would be good for helping you fall back to sleep or have more restful sleep once you are asleep?
There can be. So with sleep apnea, usually the best thing is to address the sleep apnea, which may not be an herbal approach. It may be working with a doctor to get a CPAP machine or something like that. I've learned a lot around sleep apnea, especially from the herbalist Thomas Easley, who's really helped me expand my recognition of this, which has definitely been helpful for a lot of my clients who would not have been diagnosed otherwise. So I will look at what else is going on with them to see if we can make a guess as far as what might be happening. So for sleep apnea, if they're waking up with headaches, sometimes they might be waking with dry mouth. Sometimes they might be snoring in the middle of the night. They may have blood pressure that's starting to go up. They might be nodding off more during the day. So those might be things I might look at. And if I'm seeing a lot of that, I might suggest that they go ask their PCP if they can get a referral. There are sometimes in mild apnea a few tips and tricks, and these again are things that I've mostly learned from Thomas Easley. But for example, you could prop the top of your bed up on some bricks, and that might just put you in a little bit more of an upright position. So for mild apnea, that might be enough to help prevent that relaxation. I would not be turning to those stronger sedatives. I would be more apt to turn to the nervines to help us relax, but not relax too much to worsen the apnea. And so those are a few things I might look at there. If it's blood sugar, I would look at like, how is their energy throughout the day? Are they crashing after they have a high carbohydrate meal or snack? A lot of times people will start to feel really tired, but it's very specific with the timing of what they're eating and when they're eating. It might be looking at what they're eating throughout the day and saying, I'm noticing that you're eating a lot of very high glycemic foods that are not paired with protein and fiber and vegetables and healthy fats. And so one of the best interventions there is often to support the diet, so that we're eating fewer of the high glycemic foods, which are the foods that break down into sugar more quickly in the bloodstream. So having smaller portions, more complex carbohydrates, adding more vegetables, adding more protein, and just having like more balanced meals throughout the day, and having a little less at night. I mean, if somebody needs to have some food later in the evening, that's fine, but usually looking at alcohol, late night snacking, and just the size and the concentration of what you're eating for dinner. And that's one of the biggies. There are herbs that are helpful for blood sugar as well. Magnolia bark is one that I also love for sleep, but it does have some amount of blood sugar support. There are herbs like fenugreek and cinnamon that, depending upon the person, might have some benefit. So we might turn to those as well. But oftentimes diet is the biggest intervention. And I'm not a nutritionist, but herbalists do often incorporate some amount of nutrition tips. And then if needed, we can refer folks to go to their doctors or to a nutritionist to get more specific care if necessary. And oftentimes those folks, when they do pay attention to what they're eating, do you have worse sleep after you eat a bunch of snacks at night, or after you have some alcohol at night? There are a lot of different reasons why alcohol can dysregulate sleep, and glucose response is one of them. So that might be an approach there. If it's hormonal, if it's, for example, perimenopause, we may turn to some hormonal support herbs in addition to nervines and sleep support approaches. And also just reducing stress tends to be helpful for reproductive hormones as well. But we might turn to something like shatavari being a really great herb that can sometimes help with estrogen balance, as well as being a little bit relaxing, a little bit nervine, a little bit adaptogenic, and helping to some extent with sleep and hot flashes and estrogen metabolism throughout the evening. There are plenty of others, black cohosh, sometimes Vitex. It really depends on the person, but you can certainly integrate. So there might be two formulas going on, or it may be that you're combining a couple different things into the same formula, some more traditional sleep and nervine support herbs, as well as some of those hormonal or blood sugar support herbs. So that would be one of the ways that I might approach that kind of thing.
Okay, so it seems like there are a lot of factors going on and mixing, and you have herbs that help with sleep, and herbs that help with potentially with blood sugar, hormone regulation, and everyone's sleep problems are potentially more complex than just I should have some sleepy time tea before I go to bed, and that'll take care of the problem. That we need to dig in a little deeper and figure out what's the nature of our individual sleep challenges.
Exactly. And sometimes that sleepy time tea or that sleepy time tincture works great, and that's awesome. But in the long haul, we want to be looking at, like, why is this going on, and can we support that? For me, stress is certainly a big factor, and certainly I think for Americans as a whole. So maybe we're turning to more stress support herbs throughout the day and the night, but also there are other ways of dealing with our stress beyond just that. It could be meditation. It could be saying no. It could be getting therapy. It could be spending more time exercising or outdoors. So, herbalists love our herbs, but herbs are really only one small piece of the puzzle. I like to think of them as training wheels to help nudge the body back into balance, hence the name of my first book. But we also want to be looking at the deeper picture, because that's what's going to have the most meaningful impact in the long term.
So do you have any parting thoughts or piece of advice for the listeners?
Sure. Well, I would say that it can be fun and helpful, because herbs are such a great way to start to shift our physiology and to support us. And sometimes it's hard to do all the deep things. So having herbs as a way to start to make that transition. And so if we want to talk a little bit more about some of the specific herbs that I personally love the most in my own life, sleep is definitely one of my taskmasters, as well as being real helpful for many of my clients. One of my absolute favorites is a very simple herb that many folks grow in their gardens, and that is lemon balm. Very easily cultivated, usually comes back each year. And I have found that one of the best ways to work with lemon balm, if you tolerate alcohol, is as a fresh plant tincture. And I do have a whole tincture blog on my website if you want tips on how I personally make tinctures. And my website is wintergreenbotanicals.com. But basically, we just take that fresh herb, chop it up, shove as much as you can humanly shove into a jar, and then cover it to the tippity top with the highest proof alcohol that you have access to. I tend to use 190 proof ethanol, but you can work with a 151 proof, which is 75% alcohol, or 100 proof alcohol, which is 50% alcohol, and those will work as well. And let them sit for about a month. You can shake them periodically if you want to, although technically they're so packed, there's not really a whole lot of herb that's going to move around in there, and then strain it out. And that works really, really, really well for a lot of different folks for supporting their sleep as well as their stress. And it's very simple. And oddly, that's one where commercially, I have yet to find a commercial brand of tincture that works as well as a homemade tincture, but it's easy to make. And if you don't have lemon balm, if you know anybody who grows a lot of herbs and medicinal herbs, or just likes to grow fun herbs in their garden, even if they don't do anything with them, a lot of times you can find somebody who has lemon balm in their gardens that they're willing to share with you to plant in your own, or just to go harvest some of theirs. It's a very abundant plant. If you can't do a tincture, you could try working with glycerin extracts. I don't think they're quite as strong, but sometimes they work. I would probably dry the herb a little bit, very, very gently, and then do the glycerin extract, because all the moisture content can go bad pretty quickly in the glycerin base. And lemon balm loses a lot of its aromatics pretty quickly. So you usually want to work with those remedies within 1 to 3 years or so, for whether it's a tincture or something else. Does make a lovely tea. The tea isn't quite as strong. And you can just play with it in a variety of different ways. You can even add lemon balm extract to seltzer with a lemon wedge. It's one of the recipes that's in the book. It's really pretty delicious, especially with the lemon balm or with the lemon wedge along with it. And that can be a great way to support you at night instead of a glass of alcohol, or during the day at your desk. Lemon balm is also really great for helping to support the immune system, helping act as a bit of an antiviral. It is not only calming, but also enhances cognition, so it's not too sedating. And a lot of folks who found support both at bedtime as well as during the day with lemon balm. Another gem that I've really come to appreciate that I learned about from Mary Bove as well as Leslie Williams is magnolia bark, which is a classic herb in traditional Chinese medicine. But this particular use is a little bit different than how Chinese medicine tends to view it. And that is for supporting your cortisol balance, so your stress hormones. So folks who seem to be going to that alarm mode in the middle of the night, or just feeling really stressed throughout the day, magnolia can be somewhat calming while also helping to downregulate that overreactive cortisol response. And you can work with your regular magnolias that we have growing wherever. So it doesn't always have to be the officinalis species. I tend to work with the star magnolia that grows pretty abundantly in people's gardens throughout the Northeast, and it makes fantastic medicine. So that's another really key one. And there are so many others, but those are just some 2 of my personal favorites that I work with quite frequently. One more, if I will. Passion flower. If we're going to go a little bit more to the stronger sedatives, passion flower is one of my favorites that tends to work well for a lot of people across the board, especially at bedtime, for being that dimmer switch on an overreactive nervous system. And in the research, there aren't a ton of studies that are on it, but the studies that are show really good results, oftentimes working as well as benzodiazepine drugs for things like anxiety or sleep, with far fewer side effects. And so the studies on even at moderate doses, just like a spoonful of the dry herb in tea, was quite effective in the studies. Whereas some of the other herbs like valerian, it works really well for some people, but not that well for other folks. And the research on it is not all that exciting, especially if it's just valerian. The research is not particularly impressive for it. But passion flower is an herb I tend to turn to even more often, and that grows more in warmer climates. But if you can get a hold of the true passion flower, you can grow it and bring it indoors in the wintertime, or you can pretty easily buy good quality passion flower as well.
Well, great. That's some really rich and important information. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your knowledge and this upcoming book.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me and for sharing lots of different tidbits throughout your podcast. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Resilience Radio. I hope you enjoyed that episode. If so, you can always share it with a friend, and that really helps out, and they get to hear it too. The music was brought to you by Aaron Marcus with their tune Some Biological Process. You can check the show notes for full credits on that. Until next time, sleep well and take care.